Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. If you like scary stories, hit subscribe, like the video, and share with your friends. Thanks. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. My husband and I had planned this camping trip for months, hoping to get away from the city and just relax in the woods. We found a spot deep in the forest, far from the main paths, where no one would bother us. We set up our tent, and everything seemed perfect. It started raining while we were finishing dinner. At first, it was just a light rain, but soon it turned into heavy rain. The sound of it hitting the tarp over our tent was kind of soothing at first. As it got darker, the woods around us seemed to close in, and the rain was all I could hear. The trees moved with the wind, and the whole place felt off. My husband and I were used to camping, but something about that night felt wrong. It was like the rain was hiding something, a weird kind of quiet that didn't feel right. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening. The rain just kept going, non-stop, and the wind was loud through the trees. My husband fell asleep fast, tired from our long hike, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't really alone out there. Every now and then, I thought I heard something outside the tent, a small noise under the rain. I told myself it was probably just an animal, but it didn't help me feel any better. The night dragged on, and the rain never stopped. My nerves were on edge. I closed my eyes, trying to calm down, when I heard it again. A soft crunch, like someone stepping on the wet ground, close to the tent. My heart started racing. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, hoping I was just imagining it. But then I heard it again, louder, closer. I reached over and gently nudged my husband, but he didn't wake up. I thought about waking him, but I didn't want to freak out for no reason. Maybe it was nothing, but the next sound changed everything. A long, slow scrape against the side of the tent. I froze. My mind raced. It wasn't an animal. It was slow, careful, like someone was feeling their way around the tent. My stomach tightened with fear. I felt trapped, like the thin fabric of the tent wasn't enough to keep us safe from whatever was outside. The scraping stopped. For a few seconds, everything went quiet, except for the rain. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, and I lay there, every muscle tense, waiting for the next noise. Then, without warning, the tent shook hard, like something had thrown itself against it. My husband jerked awake, startled. He didn't need to ask what was going on. He heard it too. We both stayed completely still, not even daring to move, waiting for whatever was outside to make another move. But it didn't. Instead, we heard slow, heavy footsteps. They moved away from the tent, getting quieter as they disappeared into the woods, swallowed by the sound of the rain. We didn't move for what felt like hours, too scared to breathe, too scared to even think about what had just happened. When the rain finally slowed down near dawn, we didn't waste any time. We packed up as fast as we could, leaving most of our gear behind. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. We never talked about that night, but the fear lingered. We both knew it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't lost either. Whoever or whatever was out there, it knew exactly where we were. And that thought is what still keeps me up at night, because I know whatever it was just watching us, waiting, and I can't shake the feeling it'll find us again. I was heading to the Ukraine border for a solo camping trip, not far from a small village. The plan was simple: spend the night out in the open, get a sense of the place, then move on the next morning. I had my small tent, some food, and the basics. The spot I picked was quiet, surrounded by trees with a stream nearby. It felt out of the way, which is exactly what I wanted, just me and nature. As the sun started going down, I set up camp. Once it got dark, everything went still. There was no wind, no animals, not even the sound of bugs. It was like the whole place just stopped moving. I told myself I was imagining things, but the quiet was different, like it was too quiet. It made my skin crawl. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay there staring up at the fabric ceiling. Every sound felt louder than it should. The grass under my tent crunched when I moved, and the water in the stream seemed too loud, like it was echoing. I started to get the feeling I wasn't alone. Felt like someone was out there watching, but I hadn't seen a single person all day. After a while, I heard something strange. Footsteps. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some animal, but these steps were too slow, too steady, like they were being careful. They got closer and stopped right outside my tent. I froze. My heart started pounding, and I tried not to breathe too loud. Who would be out here this late? No one knew I was camping here. I felt a shadow pass over the tent, blocking the little moonlight that was shining through. I stayed perfectly still, hoping whatever it was would go away. The footsteps started again, circling my tent like they were checking me out, like they were deciding something. I felt trapped, surrounded by nothing but thin fabric. Then, just as quickly as it started, the footsteps stopped. I lay there, not moving, waiting for what felt like forever. I slowly unzipped the tent just a little and peeked outside. There was nothing. No one was there. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe being alone out here was getting to me. But when I looked closer, I saw footprints in the dirt. They led from the trees right to my tent. Someone had definitely been there. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees. That's when I saw it. Something moving just beyond the light, slipping back into the shadows. My stomach dropped. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew I had to get out of there. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, not bothering to fold anything properly. I just needed to move. As I started walking back toward the village, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I could feel eyes on me, and every now and then, I heard faint footsteps behind me. Someone was following me, but they stayed just far enough back that I couldn't see them. The trail was rough and I tripped more than once, but I kept going. I didn't want to stop. The footsteps behind me kept pace, like they were keeping just close enough to let me know they were still there. Every time I thought I lost them, I'd hear that same slow, steady crunch of leaves. By the time I reached the village, the sky was starting to get light. I didn't stop until I was in the middle of the village, surrounded by houses and people. I finally turned around, and the path behind me was empty. Whatever had been following me was gone. I never went camping near the border again. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that feeling of being watched, of hearing footsteps just out of sight. And I wonder, whoever was out there that night, did they just stop following me? Or are they still out there, watching, waiting for the next person to come along? Maybe they're not done yet. Maybe it wasn't a random encounter. Maybe they were waiting for someone like me all along. I've been camping in the woods for years. Nothing ever made me worry. I liked how quiet it was, especially now that I'm 76. The silence out here calms me. It's nice to be away from everything, just me and the trees. This trip wasn't any different. I set up my tent by a small stream, unpacked my stuff, and got ready to enjoy a few peaceful days. The first day went fine. I cooked some food over the fire, sat by the water, and watched the sun go down behind the trees. It was a bit colder than usual, but I didn't mind. I had enough layers on, and the fire was warm. The forest got quiet, like it always did at night. You get used to it. It's kind of relaxing. I fell asleep quickly, feeling comfortable in my tent. The next morning, though, something felt off. The firewood I'd gathered was all over the place, not where I left it. I thought maybe an animal came by during the night, but there weren't any tracks. I tried not to think too much of it and went on with my day. But as the hours went by, little things started to stand out. My gear wasn't exactly where I left it. Nothing big, just small things that made me wonder if I was getting forgetful. I told myself I was just getting older, that maybe I wasn't remembering things right. But deep down, something felt wrong. That evening, as I sat by the fire, I kept looking at the trees. It didn't feel the same. The woods were quiet, but it wasn't the normal kind of quiet. Felt like something was off, like someone was watching me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was all in my head. But every little noise, every rustle in the leaves, made me tense up. My eyes kept darting to the shadows. When it got dark, I went to my tent earlier than usual. I thought if I could just sleep, maybe the feeling would go away. But it didn't. I lay there wide awake, listening. The wind had stopped, and the forest was dead silent. That's when I heard it. Soft movement outside the tent. Barely there, but enough to make me freeze. My heart was pounding and I didn't move. Then I heard it, slow footsteps, crunching on the leaves around my campsite. I stayed completely still, not even breathing, just listening. The steps got closer, slow and steady, like someone was taking their time. They circled my tent, and then I heard them go through my stuff. That's when it hit me. This wasn't an animal. This was a person. The footsteps stopped right at the tent entrance. I waited, my heart racing, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. Then I heard the zipper. Slowly, it started to open. I sat up, grabbing the knife I kept near me. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, and nothing came out. The zipper stopped halfway. I sat there, knife in hand, waiting for something to reach inside. But nothing happened. The seconds dragged on. Then, just like that, the footsteps started up again, walking away from the tent, slow and steady, disappearing into the woods. I didn't move for what felt like hours. The silence in the woods was crushing. I kept the knife close, too scared to even blink. When the first light came, I packed up everything as fast as I could and got out of there. I didn't look back. I didn't try to figure out who or what was out there. All I knew was that I wasn't alone. Something or someone had been watching me that night, walking around my camp, and it wasn't an animal. I haven't been back to those woods since. Every time I think about it, I remember the sound of those slow footsteps, how close they came, how they almost got inside my tent. There are people out there, people who hide in the woods, waiting for someone to stumble into their space. I don't know what they wanted that night, but I know this much. I was lucky. Next time, I might not be. And the thought that they're still out there, waiting for the next camper, still sends a chill down my spine. We had been planning this camping trip for weeks. My business partner, his sister, and his wife were all looking forward to spending a few nights in the woods. I'm not really into camping, but I figured it would be a good break from work. The drive was long, and as we kept going, the more cut off we felt from everything. By the time we got there, it was just us and miles of thick forest. The first night went fine. We set up our tents, had dinner, and sat around talking until it got late. But there was something about the silence that didn't sit right with me. No animals, no wind, just stillness. When it was time to sleep, I lay in my tent, trying to hear anything, but it was dead quiet. The next morning, I took a short walk to clear my head. That's when I noticed a few weird things. Some branches were snapped clean off, like someone had broken them on purpose. And there were deep footprints in the dirt, but they weren't from any animal I knew. I told myself it was just other campers, probably from nearby, and brushed it off. No one else seemed to care when I brought it up. That evening, things felt different. The air felt heavy, and once again, it was too quiet. My partner's wife went off to grab some more firewood, and his sister stayed around the camp. I watched the tree line as it started getting dark, and a bad feeling settled over me. My partner had gone down to the lake, so I stuck around to keep watch. A few minutes passed, then a few more. I kept looking around, waiting for her to come back with the wood, but she was gone longer than I thought she should be. I was just about to go after her when she walked out of the trees, empty-handed. She looked pale, like she'd seen something. She didn't speak, just sat down by the tent and stared off at nothing. We didn't ask her about it. After a while, I tried to push it out of my head. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air felt heavy again, and there was this pressure that I couldn't explain. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, right outside my tent. I froze, my heart racing, trying to stay as still as possible. The footsteps circled the tent, getting closer, then stopped right outside. I didn't move a muscle. It felt like hours passed before the steps started up again, moving back toward the woods. I sat up, trying to figure out what it was, but I didn't have the nerve to look. The next morning, I mentioned it to the group, but no one had heard anything. I started to feel like I was going crazy, like the woods were messing with me. On the last night, everything felt worse. We sat around the fire, but no one was really talking. My partner's wife kept staring at the trees, like she was waiting for something. His sister seemed jumpy, and my partner sat there rubbing his hands together like he was nervous. It wasn't like him at all. I was starting to panic inside. I wanted to leave, but something told me we shouldn't. As we sat there, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Just at the edge of the firelight, in the trees, there was a figure. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, blending in with the shadows. I blinked, thinking maybe I was seeing things, but it was still there. I looked around at the others, but no one else seemed to see it. A cold chill ran down my spine. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. I just watched. Then, without a sound, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. The next morning, we packed up early, cutting the trip short. No one talked about what had happened, and I didn't bring up what I saw. I knew they wouldn't believe me. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us the whole time. Something we weren't supposed to see. A week after we got back, I got a call from my business partner. He sounded off like he hadn't slept in days. He told me his wife had been acting strange, staring out their window at night, whispering that she could still see the trees. He didn't come into work after that. I didn't want to think about it, but now, every night, I keep hearing those footsteps outside my window, slow, heavy, and getting closer. And when I look outside, I swear I can still see that figure, just standing there, waiting. I set up my tent just as the rain started to fall. The thick jungle around me came alive with the sound of raindrops hitting the leaves, and I could hear insects buzzing faintly in the distance. I had found a small open spot in the rainforest of South America just before it got dark. The area was far from any roads or villages, exactly the kind of place I had been searching for. It felt quiet, peaceful, and for the first few hours, I thought I was lucky to have found it. As the rain got heavier, I stayed dry inside my tent. The constant patter of the rain hitting the tent became a soft, steady sound that made me sleepy. But then something shifted. Over the noise of the rain, I began to hear something else. At first, it was barely there, mixing with the rain, but the more I listened, the more I noticed it. It was a low, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the wet ground. I told myself it was probably just an animal. The jungle was full of them, and they lived here, not me. But the sound didn't move away. It stayed right outside the tent. Every time I thought it stopped, it started again, dragging through the mud just outside the thin walls of my tent. My stomach tightened with a sense of dread. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to shine the light outside. The beam cut through the rain and darkness, but I couldn't see anything strange. Just trees, thick vines, and shadows moving in the rain. The noise had stopped. I quickly zipped the tent back up, trying to calm myself down. But no matter what I told myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't really alone out here. I lay back down, but sleep never came. The rain grew even heavier, and the usual sounds of the jungle faded away. But that scraping noise returned. This time, it was louder and closer, as if something was circling my tent. It was slow and steady, like it had all the time in the world. My heart started pounding in my chest. This wasn't normal. I tried to think of what it could be. There was no way it was a person. Nobody should be out here. I was miles away from any trail, and it was the middle of the night. But animals don't drag things in circles like that. Whatever was out there, it wasn't acting like any animal I'd ever heard of. The noise kept getting louder, and then it was right next to the tent. Only the thin fabric separated me from whatever was on the other side. I froze, barely breathing, listening to the sound as it moved along the tent's side, as if it was feeling out the material, testing it. I stared at the walls of the tent, expecting to see a shape push against it at any second, but nothing happened. The rain kept pouring, making it hard to hear exactly what was happening outside. Time dragged on. The noise continued, and then, out of nowhere, it stopped. The only thing left was the sound of rain. I didn't move. I sat there in complete silence, waiting to hear anything else. But it was so quiet now that even the jungle seemed still, too still. I didn't sleep at all. I just sat there, gripping my flashlight, staring at the tent walls, listening for the slightest hint of sound. The rain finally began to ease up, and by the time the sun started to rise, the jungle was back to its normal noises. Birds calling, insects buzzing. Everything seemed fine again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. When daylight finally came, I crawled out of the tent. The ground was soft and muddy from the rain. As I walked around the tent, I saw what I had feared. The mud around the tent had been disturbed, and there were deep, long drag marks circling the tent. They were too wide for any animal I knew of. Whatever had been out there had walked all the way around my tent, multiple times, dragging something heavy behind it. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, trying not to think about what could have left those marks. As I hurried to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't done with me yet, that maybe it was still watching, waiting for me to come back. And deep down, I knew I'd never really know what it was. Something in those woods wasn't meant to be found, and I wasn't going to stay long enough to find out why. I had always dreamed of visiting every country in the world, but this time, I decided to stay closer to home. I packed my things and drove to a secluded forest in the United States. The tall trees and the sounds of nature felt like a perfect break from my busy life. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and enjoyed the quiet around me as the sun went down. When night came, I sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and listening to the sounds of the woods. I felt calm, surrounded by the rustling leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. The stars above were bright, twinkling against the dark sky. But as the night went on, a feeling of unease crept in. The forest was too quiet now. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was in nature, and it was normal to feel a bit anxious while camping alone. Around midnight, I heard a soft noise in the distance, like someone moving through the bushes. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. but the sound kept getting closer. It felt too heavy to be a small animal. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear better. Suddenly, the noise stopped, and a cold silence fell over the campsite. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The light cut through the darkness, shining on the trees, but there was nothing there. I let out a slow breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just another camper passing by. But I hadn't seen anyone on my way in, and the trailhead was far enough away that I doubted anyone would be out this late. Just as I started to relax, I heard the noise again. This time it was much closer, like something large was moving through the bushes. I stood up, gripping my flashlight tightly, my mind racing with different thoughts. I considered packing up and leaving, but the idea of walking through the dark woods alone terrified me. Then I remembered my phone. I took it out to check for a signal, hoping I could call for help. No signal. I was completely alone. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash that broke the silence, followed by heavy footsteps. Panic rushed through me. I grabbed my backpack, ready to run, when I saw a dark figure just beyond the trees. My heart sank. It was too tall and wide to be any animal. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt frozen. The figure moved closer, and I finally made a decision. I turned and sprinted into the woods, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly in front of me. Branches whipped at my face, and the ground felt uneven beneath my feet. I had no idea where I was going. I just needed to put as much space between me and that figure as I could. My breath came in quick gasps, and my legs burned, but I kept pushing myself forward. After what felt like forever, I stumbled onto an old dirt road. I didn't know where it led, but I had to take my chances. I followed it, praying it would lead me back to my car or at least somewhere safe. The footsteps behind me had stopped, but I didn't dare look back. As I walked down the road, the trees started to thin, and soon I could see the lights of a distant town. Relief flooded over me. I had finally made it out of the forest. Safety was just ahead, or so I thought. When I reached the edge of town, I spotted a diner still open and hurried inside. The warmth and light felt like a relief, but the feeling of safety was short-lived. I ordered a coffee and sat down, my heart still racing. The waitress glanced at me, her eyes wide with concern, and asked if I was okay. I nodded, but I didn't want to explain what had just happened. As I sat there, I couldn't shake the image of that figure from my mind. I glanced out the window at the dark road leading back into the woods. What if it had followed me? The thought chilled me to the bone. I looked around the diner, noticing the other customers chatting and laughing, completely unaware of what had happened just moments ago. My pulse quickened as I imagined that figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting for the next chance to strike. Looking back, I realized camping in the forest wasn't just about escaping. It was a reminder that the wild is full of unknowns, can be beautiful but also terrifying. I knew one thing for sure: I would never camp alone again. And as I finished my coffee and stepped outside, I felt the cold grip of fear wrap around me. The darkness was deep, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still out there, following me, waiting for the right moment to come back. The sun was going down as I set up camp in a clearing deep in the forest. My wife, Lisa, and I had been looking forward to this trip for months, wanting to escape the noise of our busy lives. The tall trees stretched high above us, casting long shadows, and the air smelled strongly of pine. As I took out our gear, I felt a thrill of excitement. That first night, we sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and sway. Lisa always loved being outdoors, and I enjoyed seeing her so happy. As we roasted marshmallows, a calmness washed over us. The sounds of the forest wrapped around us like a warm blanket, making everything feel perfect. But as the fire burned low, a strange noise broke the quiet. It wasn't the wind. It came from deeper in the trees. Lisa noticed it too, and her smile faded. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some small animal. We decided to go to bed, tired from the hike. I woke up later, feeling uneasy. The darkness outside felt heavy and thick. I looked over at Lisa, but she wasn't in the tent. Panic surged in my chest. I crawled out, calling her name softly, worried I might disturb the peace of the night. The forest was disturbingly quiet now. I stepped away from the tent, my flashlight cutting through the blackness. I swept the light around, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. As I ventured deeper into the trees, the rustling returned, louder this time, almost like footsteps. My heart raced as I called out again, but silence answered me. I fought the urge to run back to the tent. Instead, I kept searching, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have happened. After what felt like hours, I finally spotted her backpack lying near some bushes. I rushed over, my fear growing. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Her jacket was on the ground, ripped and stained. I bent down, feeling sick as I noticed drops of blood on the leaves nearby. With dread gripping me, I followed the trail deeper into the forest. Each step felt heavier than the last. The rustling returned, now sounding even closer. I reached a small clearing and froze. In the pale moonlight, I saw her. Lisa was lying on the ground, completely still. I rushed to her side, kneeling beside her. I could see she was alive, but barely. Her eyes opened slightly, filled with confusion and fear. I didn't know what had happened. Looking around, I noticed signs of a struggle, broken branches and disturbed earth. I gently shook her, begging her to stay awake. "We need to get out of here," I thought, knowing she couldn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, and my panic rose higher. I quickly checked for injuries, but I wasn't a doctor. All I could think of was getting her to safety. I wrapped my arms around her and lifted her up, trying to stay calm as I turned back toward our campsite. The rustling returned, this time sounding menacing. I hurried through the trees, every snap of a twig echoing in the silence. Finally, I spotted the glow of our campfire in the distance. I pushed forward, feeling the weight of Lisa in my arms. When I reached the tent, I laid her down gently and quickly grabbed my phone to call for help. The rustling grew louder, almost like a growl, and I could feel fear gripping my heart. I dialed emergency services, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Just then, I heard footsteps coming closer and looked up. My heart sank as I saw a figure stepping out of the shadows. A man, wild-eyed and disheveled, standing just outside the light. "Help her!" I yelled, but the figure just stared at me with a twisted smile creeping across his face. My mind raced. There was no time. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at him, trying to buy myself some time. "Stay away from us!" I shouted, my voice shaking. Then he lunged forward, and I reacted on instinct. I threw my flashlight at him, narrowly missing as I grabbed Lisa's backpack and swung it like a weapon. The man hesitated, caught off guard, giving me just enough time to grab Lisa and pull her into the tent. I zipped it up quickly, holding my breath, praying it would keep him out. I could hear him outside, pacing and mumbling to himself, sending chills down my spine. My phone was still connected, and I whispered our location to the operator, my voice barely above a whisper. The minutes felt like hours as I listened to him moving around, searching for a way in. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. The figure froze, and hope surged through me. The sounds of sirens grew louder, and I could see red and blue lights flashing outside the tent. In that moment, I thought we were finally safe. But just as the sirens got closer, the man laughed softly, a sound that sent ice through my veins. "You think they can save you?" he whispered, his voice low and taunting. "This is just the beginning." The authorities arrived, scattering him off into the woods. As they rushed Lisa away, I stood there, still in shock. The beauty of the forest around us was now tainted by what we had just faced. As I left the forest behind, I knew this trip had changed us forever. Every tree, every shadow now felt threatening. I promised myself I would never take our safety for granted again. But as I looked back at the dark woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only seen the tip of something much darker lurking just beneath the surface. The haunting laughter of that man echoed in my mind, a reminder that danger could be hiding anywhere, waiting for the next chance to strike.